Day to all the dads that are out there, and I want to honor all the dads who are here viewing this right now, and you're involved in your children's lives, whether they're kids or adults. Maybe you're running them around a lot still, or helping pay for things, or playing catch with them, or leading different clubs or teams with your kids. Way to go, man. God is using you in your family's life. And you guys know, man, this world is so complex. So as a guy, you're always wrestling with whether you can make it, am I good enough for this? And we can sometimes honestly be our own worst critics, So I want to ask you this question, and this is for everybody listening. Where do you feel that you don't measure up? I think it's an important question for us to ask periodically. But here's the good news. God uses ordinary, everyday people. You don't have to be super special, although God looks at everyone as super special. You can just be ordinary, everyday. You all measure up. So I want to tell you a story about an ordinary, everyday guy. And his story starts out that way anyhow. His name is Nehemiah. And he is a cupbearer for King Artaxerxes of Persia. So in other words, his job was to drink and to eat the king's food before the king did, to test it to see if it was poisoned. So talk about the definition of expendable, right? That right there is a non-essential worker right there, right? I remember speaking of that in the early days of COVID, I found out that I was non-essential. My wife Laura was a nurse, and she's on the front lines in the healthcare systems at the hospitals, helping people with COVID. And my then 19-year-old son and daughter they were Chick-fil-A employees. And so in the morning, my wife would put her scrubs on, and she went to the hospital floors to take care of people. And then my kids would put their red Chick-fil-A polos on and serve chicken sandwiches to everybody. And they were all told to go into work because y'all can't cook for yourselves anymore these days, guys. And so as a pastor, though, I was told I was non-essential. So I'll stay home in your shorts and t-shirt. Let everybody else in the family go out and do their essential work. Well, Nehemiah receives this bad news while he's doing his work. And he ends up I don't know if you knew this, but he's displaced in Persia. He doesn't live in Israel. He lives in Persia, very, very far from where Israel was, because years before, the Babylonian Empire had taken many of the Israelites from home to integrate into their empire. This was very common back in the ancient days. And so Persia eventually defeated Babylon. And so finally, this news comes from his homeland, Israel, after 100 years of dispersion, 100 years of displacement, just a handful of people that live in that Jerusalem area. So we pick up this reading in Nehemiah 1, verse 2. It says, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. That was a part of Israel. I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity, about how things were going in Jerusalem. And they said to me, things are not going well. Those words are important. Things are not going well. For those who returned to the province of Judah, they are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. Things are not going well. Everything was a pile of rubble and a pile of heartbreak as well. Now, this may resonate with you. Things may not be going well in your own life. This may be why you're here today, why you're viewing this. The life that you planned for yourself, it's not on schedule. Matter of fact, maybe it's even non-existent. Well, in Nehemiah's day, about 50,000 people were living in Jerusalem. And there were no jobs. There was no organized government. There was no direction. Honestly, there really wasn't any hope. So what do you do when you don't know what to do? Well, Nehemiah gives us a blueprint as to what we can do. He shows us. So first thing he did was that he took time to grieve. Nehemiah 1:4, the first part of the verse says, when I heard this, I sat down and wept. Grief's an emotional reaction really to loss. And we've experienced a ton of loss over the last few years. The problem is we're lousy at grieving these days. Yet life is all about losses, isn't it? The loss of loved ones, the loss of dreams, of financial endeavors, infertility, job loss, missing out on promotions or colleges that you've applied for, loss of boyfriends and girlfriends, divorce. I mean, the list goes on and on. We experience loss quite a bit in life. Paul writes something very insightful to the church who is enduring lots of loss. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to believers who have died so that you will not grieve like people who have no hope." The church that he was writing to was enduring very difficult persecution. Some lost jobs, some lost status, and some even lost their lives as martyrs. Now, notice what Paul says. Not don't grieve. He says, don't grieve like the rest of mankind grieves. Well, how does mankind grieve? Well, lots of different ways, and none of them are really that good of a way to grieve. Some grieve by numbing. Whatever it takes to get rid of that pain, whether that's drinking too much, eating too much, watching too much TV, working too much. I mean, name all the addictions that are out there. A lot of times people cope with grief by doing this. Some cope with grief by avoiding. They'll avoid their feelings. They'll just act like that nothing's really wrong. They'll avoid people and they'll just be in isolation. That's very common these days. And then still another way that we mess up when it comes to grieving is that we just try to move on rather than moving through the grief. Maybe these are ways that you have grieved. Maybe you're like, man, I've been guilty on all three of these. And this isn't to shame you or anything with this. This is not intended to make you feel bad. Grief is complex. It can be complex for us all, but it can be more in our lives, actually. It can be a blessing in our lives. And because here's the good news, we can grieve with hope. So grief is always associated with it's always associated in our lives with trying to bring health back to a situation that's lost. So it can be navigated in a purposeful way. There is such a thing as good grief as we navigate complex issues and feelings of loss. So how should we grieve then? Well, here's how it's different for us as followers of Jesus. We need to grieve with other followers of Jesus, with other people. A lot of the numbing that goes on, it does so in isolation. So we need to grieve with people who are close to us. You don't need 100 people to grieve with, but man, 1, 2, or 3 can make a big difference. We also need to grieve with expectation. This is what makes us different as followers of Jesus. We know that there is more to this life than only this life. This is what Paul was talking about. That we are death and resurrection people, that Jesus died, he rose again, that we will die, but we will raise again anew as well. This is what Jesus did for us. So we can grieve with this expectation that there's more to this life than even this life or this loss that we're feeling. But we can also grieve with some perspective. Grief is good for us for perspective. It allows us to really make sure that we're keeping the main thing. So, so many of us try to avoid funerals these days. We'll do anything to not go to a funeral. We'll go to a wake, but not funerals. Yet funerals are so meaningful to grieving families. It's important for who they look around and see there, and it's important that there's people around them. But there are also really important moments in your life that show you how, maybe for instance, how fleeting life is, or how important our priorities and relationships really are, so that if you have a broken relationship, maybe you'll put that on the front burner and say, I need to fix this, or set aside some of my pride or my hurt or whatever it could be. So after you sit down and grieve, the next thing that Nehemiah did was that he went to God in prayer. And this is what you and I can do as well. He says here at the second part of verse 4, in fact, for days I mourned, I fasted, and then I prayed to the God of heaven. He doesn't just pray for days, he prays for months, actually, if you read through the book of Nehemiah. We feel so overwhelmed so many times because we don't take things to God. Consistently, daily, giving things over to God. This kind of prayer brings such perspective and such hope to our lives. Prayer places God in his rightful place and us too as well. So this reminds me of a statement that author and pastor Bob Merritt says. He goes, having everything planned in your life according to your will actually prevent me from seeing what God has planned according to his will. I mean, that really just spoke to me. A lot of times, in other words, we can get in our own way, can't we? You might be going through overwhelming circumstances, even right now today. Bring that to God. How will I rebuild our finances after this mess that we got in? Start by bringing it to God. How am I ever going to feel like I belong? I just feel so isolated. Bring this concern to God. Do like Nehemiah. Kneel down and pray. As a matter of fact, in the book of Nehemiah, there are 17 recorded prayers. He was a person who prioritized and practiced prayer. Some of us, we just don't have this habit of prayer. We will pray in emergencies, but it's not prioritized or practiced consistently. So, what would it look like for you to pray first? Maybe not until you've tried everything else in your life. Or before you go to work, pray. Or before you end your day, just a quick prayer. What if you did this for the next 3 weeks? I think God can do things when we pray. He changes our heart. He changes the hearts of other people. So do as Nehemiah did and kneel down and pray. The third thing that Nehemiah did that we could all follow is that he moved forward in action. So he takes this, going back to the story, he takes the king a cup of wine, and the king notices how sad that Nehemiah is. And so we pick up the reading in chapter 2, verse 1. He says, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. And then what we see next is an example of just a quick prayer because Nehemiah was so used to praying. Well, the king asked, well, how can I help you? And with a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied. This is like this quick prayer that he had. And then he gave this answer. If it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. And this is where living with character, guys, matters in your life. Because the king knew Nehemiah. He witnessed his character's work ethic firsthand. He knew Nehemiah was a good guy, a good man. So Nehemiah makes another ask besides as well. And he asks for a list of resources as well, not just time off, but some resources to help rebuild these walls and these gates. And the king granted him these things and an escort to do so. So he goes to Jerusalem with all of this stuff. And I love this because Nehemiah had to be so surprised at the grace of God here. So many things in maybe Nehemiah's life were not going as well as he wanted, but he saw God's grace in this moment. And faith always involves a step forward into uncertainty, doesn't it? It's always uncomfortable. Matter of fact, if you're comfortable, you're probably not living by any faith. God enjoys when we step out in faith and we trust him. This reminds me of a vacation I was recently on where our granddaughter Nolly would jump. She's only 2 years old, just turned 2. She would jump into the pool with her mom or her dad in the pool, and she would jump off the edge, and they would catch her. And this was a beautiful picture of trust. And it's a beautiful picture of how God wants us to step out, to jump in, to trust him as well. And so when you've done all of these three things, that, you've sat down to grieve, you have gone to God in prayer, and now you're stepping forward in faith, you really come to grips with how broken our world really is, because you realize, and this is what I want to do for you today, is help you understand that there will be opposition, right, when you do this. And opposition is normal. It's not personal just to you only. It's very, very normal. And so we see this in Nehemiah 4. Sanballat, this is a very tough character here. He was very angry. He was a leader in the Jerusalem region there. He was kind of this tribal leader type person, and he did not like what was going on. So he's very angry when he learned that we were building a wall. This is Nehemiah writing this letter. He flew into a rage, actually, and he mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build this wall in a single day or just by offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think that they can make something out of stones from a rubbish heap and charred stones, charred ones at that?" And then another character, Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "Oh, that stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it." So these guys were just harassing, teasing, trying to kill morale of what was going on. The devil and the forces of hell will see you as a threat when you live by faith. This is what's going to happen. And they will use people in your life. And this may have happened on your way to even viewing this today. You may have battled to get here. Maybe you intended to watch this yesterday or the day before that, and you finally got here because there were so many things in the way. Maybe you're wanting to get out of debt and follow God's financial principles for your life. And you're starting off great. You're like, "I'm excited." And then your car breaks down. And you're like, "Man, what are the odds of that?" You're experiencing opposition. You go and you share your dream with somebody of what you want to accomplish or do. And they're not as excited about it as you are. "Oh, maybe you're too old for that, or you're too young for that." How about just like, "Hey, you're too negative for that," you could say to them, right? Because God is bigger than our small minds and our small perspectives. So if God is calling you to step out in faith, I want to encourage you to do it, to make a difference. But I want you to also know there will be critics, and they may be relentless like they were with Nehemiah. Nehemiah, after all this was said and done, and he was in Judah, in Israel, he had to be resilient. He had to be strong. He had to be consistent. He writes in chapter 6, "So Sanballat and Geshem," another character, Geshem, "sent a message asking me to meet them at one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But I realized they were plotting to harm me. So I replied by sending this message to them. I'm engaged in a great work, so I can't come. Why should I stop working to come and to meet with you?" So he is on to them. He rebuffs them. But did you know that 5 times they make this request? And 5 times Nehemiah declines that offer. These guys were relentless at trying to stop him. Well, chapter 6, verse 15, we hear some great news. It says, "So on October 2, the wall was finished, just 52 days after we had begun." This is amazing, guys. He says, "When our enemies and the surrounding nations heard about it, they were frightened and they were humiliated. And they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God." Think about this, guys. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, things had been in peril for almost 100 years. Nothing had happened. People suffered. Terrible living conditions. No real order or chance to thrive. Broken dreams. Just stuck. And the number of days to rebuild that wall was just 52. They did it in 52 days, what people said in almost 100 years could not be done. Notice there's no angels to help them. They were not building the bricks and laying the bricks that way. It was an ordinary guy whose heart was broken at the plight of his people, who sat down and grieved. He knelt down and prayed, and then he moved forward in faith, and he faced consistent and relentless opposition. And God received the glory because it was God who changed the heart of the king. It was God who gave him strength and vision. It was God who gave fortitude to the people. And so, guys, we are a people as a family of Fellowship Church. And this is my dream for FC, is that what we're doing and the changed lives that we're witnessing, that we would recognize that it's because God is involved in this endeavor. And that makes this place special. Lives have been supernaturally changed. Gifts have been supernaturally given. Vision and heart and strength to be unified behind the mission God has coalesced and brought together our hearts. And guys, this applies to your own families. This applies to your own jobs, your work, and what you do in your life, the opportunities that God has given you. And maybe that's where this needs to be applied for you. I mean, imagine if we do this together. The legacy that'll change lives, your family's lives being changed, and ultimately changing a community in the world. Somebody once said, if you're not dead, then God's not done with you. And I love that statement because God is always at work within us. So God, as we pray to you, may we pay attention to the divine burdens that you give us deep in our hearts, like you did to Nehemiah. May we see the why and the purpose of the lives, of our lives to live for Jesus. And may we not quit too early, but pray and stay the course that you've given to us. Guys, this reminds me of the prayer of Paul to the church in 1 Corinthians 15:58, where he says, so my dear brothers and sisters, he's talking to a church here, be strong and immovable. Always work enthusiastically for the Lord, for you know that nothing you do for the Lord is ever useless. And I'll end by saying this. Jesus did all these things. Jesus lived on this earth just like we do. He grieved just like we do. He prayed so much that the disciples asked him to teach them how to pray. He stepped forward into the uncomfortable, and he endured horrible opposition all the way to the cross. And then he rose victorious. And so today, he's the author and finisher of our faith. He's the example we look to. He's the one we draw strength from. And so my encouragement to you today is to continue to follow him. That's our theme for this year. We are following Jesus. So be a follower today. Follow Jesus, and he will bring you through.